introduce Dr. Abby Kinchy to our seminar series today. Dr. Kinchy's biography states that she is a sociologist working within the interdisciplinary field of science and technology studies, or STS. I hope that I'm not being too forward when I revise that statement to say that Dr. Kinchy is a scholar at the forefront of shaping the discussions, concerns, and scholarly infrastructure scaffolding the field of STS in the present moment. In addition to her role as a professor at RPI, just up the road from Millbrook, she also serves on the editorial board of Engaging Science and Technology Studies, an open access journal for the field of STS. She's also the founder of the ultra cool STS Underground Research Network, which investigates mining, burial, and subterranean exploration from an STS perspective. I'm highlighting these achievements, the ones that often get buried in the bottom of our CVs, to demonstrate Dr. Kinchy's commitment to creating long-term social and scholarly networks. When the postdocs began planning the Ecology and Justice seminar, I immediately thought of Dr. Kinchy's work on participatory science, activism, and environmental governance. The topics she addresses are ones that many of us are grappling with in our own work. For instance, how do we build local knowledge, perspectives, and problems into our research questions? And from the abstract of today's talk, how do we advocate for social change when you are also trying to build a reputation for scientific credibility? With these questions in mind, it is my sincere hope that today's seminar opens new paths of inquiry between ecology and STS. It is with great pleasure that I then pass the screen over to Dr. Kinchy. You can share the screen.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Amanda. I really appreciate that. So let's get these slides going. All right, so hi everyone. I hope you can see the slides and I hope you can hear me. And happy Earth Day, right? Today is a day we should be thinking about these kinds of topics, perhaps even more than usual. So I'm going to be talking today about some of my efforts to move toward justice in participatory environmental research. And let's see if I can get these to advance. Okay, so in addition to today being Earth Day, this is also Citizen Science Month. Maybe some of you are aware of this. There have been a lot of activities going on around the world, getting us to think about participation in scientific research in many different forms. And I think this really indicates how much citizen science, or others call it community science, or we might call it participatory science, is really spreading in popularity and in applications. And I'm just very curious, if any of you have been involved in a citizen science project of some sort, I would be really interested in seeing what, if you could type that in the chat, the topic and maybe the location. I'd be very interested in seeing what kinds of projects you've been doing. So I'm going to try to address three different themes in this presentation today. The first is how to focus on justice and equity when we're designing, promoting, and carrying out participatory environmental research. The second are the dilemmas that are often encountered when we're trying to build community partnerships. And then finally, although I think it will be a little bit less of a theme, but maybe we can tackle it more in the discussion that follows, how do we find institutional support for projects that don't fit neatly into existing categories? I'm going to be drawing on, well, first I'm going to be talking about my current research, which is to develop a community science approach to testing for heavy metals in soil. And I'm also going to be drawing on my previous work. I'm going to present some case studies from the book Science by the People that I co-authored with Aya Kimura. And I'll draw on some of my previous research about volunteer water monitoring during the Marcellus Shale natural gas boom. So let's first begin by talking about the issue of lead in soil. I like to use the phrase from the environmental writer Rob Nixon to describe lead in soil as an attritional catastrophe. Many people, I'm sure everyone here is aware that lead poisoning is a problem in the United States. We often think of it in relation to peeling paint, that is old paint before lead-based paints were banned, and also lead contaminated water. We've all been paying attention to what happened in Flint and in other cities. But often lost in our public discussions about lead exposure is soil, and soil is another really important pathway for lead exposure, because kids like my son here on this slide love to put dirt in their mouths. They also just get their hands dirty playing outside, put their hands in their mouths, their toys get dirt on them, they put toys in their mouths. So just at that really vulnerable age when exposure to lead is really problematic, kids are often getting soil in their mouths. So where does all the lead come from in soil? Well, it comes in part from peeling paint, right? Exterior paint falling into soil, but it's also from our legacy of mining and industry into the air, into the soil and the water, but also decades of burning leaded gasoline. So wherever we have had a lot of traffic, we are also probably going to find lead in the soil. And so cities are often a site with pretty high levels of lead in the soil. So the good news is that there are a lot of people who are committed to doing community engaged soil research to confront this challenge. There are, these are just a sampling of a few. We found more than 20 such projects around the United States, where usually someone based at a university is partnering with a community group, a community garden, or some other kind of community organization to collect soil samples and analyze them. So this is, I think, a really exciting, this is an exciting way that people are participating in dealing with this challenge. So just recently, over the past year, a postdoc who I'm working with named Dan Walls and I designed a study to learn about these kinds of projects. We conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with about 30 community engaged soil researchers. And we really, initially, we were interested in just learning more about how these kinds of projects work, because we were interested in doing a project like this ourselves. But these interviews also shed light on a lot of problems in the ways that lead contamination is governed in this country. And so we've actually just submitted a paper for publication that looks at soil lead policy from the perspective of these community engaged researchers. A common theme is that neither regulatory institutions nor scientific institutions value or prioritize soil testing. And partly this is because, as Dan, my collaborator has said, that this kind of work, testing soil, preventing exposures to contaminated soil, is a kind of maintenance work. You're not really producing novel discoveries. We all know that there's lead in soil and it poisons people. The challenge is to actually locate those contaminated areas and do something about it. And so there's not a lot of research funding dedicated to this particular problem. And then in terms of the regulatory science domain, we were frequently informed that testing for soil typically comes after a child has been discovered to have high levels of blood or lead in their blood. So the soil testing is not usually being conducted in a preventative way. It's actually following the initial indicator of lead in the environment, which is a child being poisoned. And so many of the people we interviewed indicated that this was really immoral. This was an immoral way to address or to monitor this problem in the environment. We also heard from many that existing regulatory frameworks, which really focus on holding single polluters accountable, are just a poor fit for this challenge. There's really not one single polluter that we can say, hey, you need to clean up this mess you made, because this is a long legacy of environmental pollution that involves many different actors over many years. But so one of the things that we discovered in talking with all these different organizations is that they're typically working with communities to use the laboratory equipment that they have available. And most rely on pretty expensive lab equipment that they have at their universities, or that they have a grant to buy an expensive piece of equipment. But we were inspired by a project in Chile that is actually developing a low-cost field kit for testing soil for some heavy metals. So I am now collaborating with Sebastián Ureta, a sociologist in Chile. And he's an expert on the governance of mining-related pollution there. And he came to me with an interest in exploring the utility of citizen science tools in that context, in the context of mining-related waste. And so he's been working with designers and soil experts to develop a kit for screening soil for arsenic and copper, which are two important contaminants there. And they've started conducting workshops with communities who are facing mining-related pollution. So we decided to build on this project and try to make these tools relevant to the US context, where lead in urban soils is a particularly significant problem. And we thought that using these kinds of low-cost field kits is important because it makes the role of community members in the community-based soil testing projects more active in terms of actually engaging in the scientific work, not just taking samples, but actually analyzing the samples and interpreting the results that they get. So we were really fortunate to get support from the Science and Technology Studies program at the National Science Foundation to put together this interdisciplinary team to try to develop this community-based approach to soil testing. It's very interdisciplinary. As you can see, we have a chemical engineer, there's two of us who are sociologists, geographer, artists, an environmental health scientist, one of my students who's a student in sustainability studies. And then we're going to be selecting and training 15 people from our neighborhood. I'm in Troy, New York, and we're focusing on a neighborhood in Troy that has a particular set of both economic and environmental challenges that make it a really important place to focus on an environmental justice question. So those soil justice fellows will be joining us this summer. So let me just articulate what the objectives of the project are. I've already said we want to develop low-cost field methods for identifying the location and concentration of heavy metals in soils, particularly lead and arsenic. We're also going to utilize these tools alongside art and local knowledge to identify hazards and support action to make our neighborhoods safer. We are really fortunate to be partnering with an organization in Troy called the Sanctuary for Independent Media. This is an organization that started really as an arts organization, particularly filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, and has just grown to be this really amazing, mostly volunteer-run organization that has a radio station, a brand new community science lab, they're doing research partnership with Riverkeeper. They have a youth employment program that engages youth in environmental justice work. Let's see, they've got a million other things going on. It's a really pretty amazing and vibrant place. So we're partnering with them for the implementation of the community-based portions of our project. So that gives you a little sense of where we are with this project. There's so much more that I could share, but I'm going to move on to some of the more conceptual questions. So as I engage in this kind of work, I have frequently returned to three different questions about justice. And these three questions were really at the heart of the book that Aya Kimura and I wrote and frame the approach that we took in that book. And they're also the questions that I frequently ask myself and ask my team members as we think about how to structure our project, how to create relationships with our community partners and with the soil fellows. So the first question is, how can this project help to expand participation in political decision making? And this is a question of procedural justice. That is, how are our procedures of making decisions about important issues surrounding the environment, access to resources, and so forth, are they fair? Do they involve everyone who needs to be involved? And we know that decision-making in the United States about environmental issues is often made by, those decisions are often made by experts, right? People with access to specialized knowledge. And that often excludes many people who are affected by those decisions. So when we think about participation through citizen science, we're not just talking about making science itself more inclusive or having more people participating in science, but actually using citizen science as a lever or a platform to expand participation in political processes as well. So if we start thinking about our project in that way, we really have to think about what are we going to do with our results, and how is the process of organizing people in this work expanding their capacity to actually participate in public life more broadly. The second question is, how can this project produce knowledge from vantage points that are commonly left out of science? And we can think of this as a kind of epistemic justice. Whose knowledge counts? Who's allowed to make claims? Who's seen as credible? And so we really want to think about how to include people in the practice of science who have historically into this scientific authority. And finally, how can this project challenge environmental inequality? And this is the environmental justice question, right? Who is unfairly burdened with exposures to lead and arsenic and other environmental contaminants, and who has access to environmental goods like parks, clean air, fresh water, and so forth. So I want to talk about how we're dealing with each of these questions so far in our project. So the first, in terms of expanding participation in political decision-making, we're really trying to think carefully about how to connect the data that we collect with effective advocacy. So, of course, we know that scientific facts are important, but they don't speak for themselves. So this is why our partnership with the Sanctuary is really essential. They have the tools and experience with media and community organizing that enables us to connect the scientific work to the broader world of advocacy around environmental justice issues. So these are just, on the slide, we've got a couple of examples, Dan and I speaking on their community radio station, some images from other recent community organizing events that have been happening through the Sanctuary. Now, in terms of producing knowledge from vantage points that are often excluded from scientific communities, our approach has been to recruit people to participate in the project that we're treating as Soil Justice Fellows. These will include youth, parents of small children who may be concerned about their kids' lead exposure, and urban gardeners. And ideally, all of these participants will be from the North Troy neighborhood, which is, as I mentioned before, an impoverished and politically marginalized community. So we want to make sure that these fellows are the ones making key decisions about the questions to ask and the ways to interpret, contextualize, and present the results. So what we see on the slide here, we have worked with some student artists to make this really cool comic book. I'm really excited about it. It's just finished. And so we're going to be sharing the comic book to try to generate interest in the project in the neighborhood. And then right now we're in the process of trying to figure out the structure of the workshops, the trainings that we'll have for people so they can learn to take samples, analyze soil, interpret the results, and use the results for action. And so we want to figure out how to structure those in ways where the participants are making key decisions about the questions to ask and what to do with that information. So then a third question, the one about environmental justice. So as I already said before, we know that environmental problems disproportionately affect social groups that are already oppressed and disadvantaged. And this is clearly the case when we look at lead exposures. There's strong evidence that Black children have far higher levels of blood lead poisoning than other children in the United States. And we really have to confront this directly, right? This is, even though as this graph shows, overall lead levels have gone down since the 1980s and early 90s. Black children are still twice as likely than white children to have elevated blood lead. And so, we can't pretend that this isn't happening. This has to be part of the work that we do. And here's just another way of looking at this issue. This is a map of our region. We're in Troy, that big red blob indicating the percent of children with elevated lead levels. And we also note that there's a neighborhood in Albany that has exceptionally high levels of lead. And that neighborhood is a predominantly Black neighborhood that has high levels of poverty as well. So we realized that we really needed to, in doing these workshops or doing this work, we had to look beyond questions just about where the lead is. But though it's clear from maps like this that lead poisoning is highest in neglected urban areas, but we also have to examine inequality in resources for dealing with it. So how do people have access to the resources they need to prevent exposures? So we want to think about exploring and documenting the social dimensions of lead exposure. This could include things like unscrupulous landlords, the history of redlining that has led to the neglect and decay of certain neighborhoods, and regulatory neglect of particular neighborhoods and groups of people. So unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we've been had to slow things down a little bit because the kinds of workshops that we're planning involve people really getting together, touching soil and being near each other to think about it. And so social distancing has made this difficult. But we will begin in midsummer to work with community members and small groups. But I can't yet share experiences from the field. But I am going to reflect on some of the challenges beyond the pandemic, which has been challenging enough, that make this kind of work more complex than ordinary academic research. And so to talk about those dilemmas, I'm going to draw on other case studies that I have written about. There are, as I've learned, many dilemmas for those who are trying to use citizen science or other participatory methods to advance social and environmental justice. And I really want to reflect on those because they've helped me think a lot about my own project. So the first dilemma that I want to talk about has to do with the emphasis on volunteerism in citizen science. And I can illustrate this dilemma with the case of volunteer water monitoring in the Marcellus Shale region. So as probably most people here know, there have been lots of different environmental concerns raised about extracting gas from shale here in the Northeast. So air pollution, water pollution, and more. So starting in 2010, I participated in a volunteer water monitoring group based in the southern tier of New York. And our goal was to document baseline water quality. This was both to advocate for watershed protection, but also to have evidence that if gas drilling began in the region and it polluted water supplies, we would have documentation of what the water quality was like before. There was a sense that you needed to have proof that there was a change in quality. So these kinds of projects, particularly baseline water monitoring, sprung up all across Pennsylvania as well. And so as part of my research that was funded by NSF at that time, I surveyed and interviewed all of those organizations, or nearly all of them, and ended up producing this map. So let me talk you through this a little bit. So this is Pennsylvania and New York State, and all these gray areas here are watersheds. And if they're shaded in gray, it means we found volunteer groups that were doing water monitoring specifically with the gas industry in mind. And so what's remarkable here, I think we just have to note, is just the extent of volunteer mobilization to monitor watersheds. This was in 2012. I think, it's just incredibly impressive. But at the same time, what we noticed is that there are these areas in white where we did not find any volunteer monitoring organizations. And this is troubling in particular in this area that I've circled in red, because that part of northeastern Pennsylvania is very intensively developed by the natural gas industry. It has a very high concentration of gas wells. And so we noticed that there was this disconnect between the place that was actually probably experiencing the most environmental change and the prevalence of volunteers doing any kind of environmental monitoring work. So this example, I think, hits home the problem that relying on volunteers to monitor the environment can lead to unequal access to knowledge, right? Unequal knowledge about particular places. So I think this has broader implications where we really need to re-examine volunteering, what it means when we do these kinds of projects. Of course, we can think of volunteering as an act of good citizenship, and that's how many volunteers in these kinds of projects see what they're doing. But at the same time, volunteering can also be viewed as a kind of forced self-sufficiency at a time of government rollbacks, right? So if regulatory agencies are not doing the work, volunteers do it because no one else is. And in fact, many of the volunteers who were doing water monitoring told me this. They would say things like, yeah, I feel like we're doing what the state should be doing. So we have already heard, from others, if you've been paying attention to debates about community science, many community groups have already argued that they need to be paid for their time, for their knowledge, and their labor. And so I think that we need to really think differently about what we're doing when we talk about volunteers. I suggest that we might want to look at a community organizing framework for citizen science, or something like a participatory action research framework, rather than a volunteering model, if we want to achieve systemic change and address problems at a wider scale. So, this is a difficult thing to do. In our project, we fortunately have a grant where we're able to pay our soil justice fellows for their time. And we are also planning the kind of work that they do in ways that builds their capacity to lead future workshops, to be leaders in their community, that they're not just volunteering to help me. Like, I'm not the one with skin in the game, they are. And so I think that this is these are not perfect solutions, but it's a way to begin to navigate this dilemma. So let me go on to the next dilemma, which has to do with credibility. So, right, there are lots of perceived tensions between activism and credibility. And one of the critiques that has been made of citizen science is that people with a political point of view might skew the data somehow. But I want to argue something that's kind of complicated here. I want to argue that activism can improve scientific research, and at the same time, citizen science can improve political activism, that these are not in conflict. But I'm going to use a different case study now to make this point. I've written pretty extensively about the movement in defense of maize in Mexico. This is the subject of my first book, and it's a chapter in Science by the People. This movement arose around the year 1999, 2000, and particularly heightened in 2000 when American scientists discovered genetically engineered corn growing in Mexico, where it was not approved for planting. And this sparked major protests by indigenous communities, small-scale farmers, and environmentalists. Mexico is the birthplace of corn. It's the place where it was first domesticated, and it's a home to this incredible genetic diversity of corn varieties. It's also the staple food. It also has spiritual meaning for many indigenous groups. So there are a lot of reasons why this was a very intensely political issue. But the Mexican government showed little concern for the spread of unlicensed genetically engineered crops or their potential threats to native corn varieties. And the scientists who had initially made that discovery were really roundly attacked for the study that they did. And there were many efforts to try to damage their credibility. So a coalition of communities and organizations put together a community-based study where farmers collected samples for genetic analysis in a commercial lab. Now, some of their findings are summarized in this excerpt from a press release. It's about a 5-page press release, so this is just a few points. Important to note here is that this was the first study to systematically analyze samples from multiple states across the entire country. And honestly, I don't think this would have ever been achieved by academic or government scientists, because it really required the collective effort of dozens of rural and indigenous communities. And unsurprisingly, after this work came out, advocates for the biotechnology industry tried to ridicule the study, just as they had attacked the American scientists who first made the discovery of transgenic corn in Mexico. But the activists who I interviewed were really not fazed by this. That was not their fight, really. They knew they had used a reputable laboratory, and they knew that their sample, or at least the scope of their research, was far better than any official research had done. The research itself gave them confidence in themselves. It strengthened ties among the many different communities, and it allowed them to develop strategies for protecting corn biodiversity and advocating for policy change. So as a study, this was very credible for the people it mattered to, and it enabled them to take on a next phase of the work, protecting corn varieties. So I think that this case can illustrate that credibility can mean different things, and that credibility in the eyes of affected communities is especially important, right? It can help communities to validate their experiences of environmental injustice. But there's still a dilemma here. The idea that science and activism should not mix is deeply ingrained in the scientific field, right? And I think importantly, well, first of all, we know that professional scientists, I think, understandably are then hesitant to engage in work that might be perceived as activism, but perhaps more insidiously, we often see industry groups, PR groups working for industry, really using this idea to cast doubt on the credibility of people who are making claims about environmental pollution. So it's very important that we learn how to resist simplistic arguments against so-called politicizing science. But to do that, we're really going to need, we can't just do that individually, right? We need the support of our universities, our funders, science journalists who write about these issues. And we have to push back on the idea that standing up for justice is somehow incompatible with doing good science. But at the same time, we do have to make sure, we have to anticipate that these kinds of attacks will come, right? And so, and for our own community's credibility, we need to make sure that our data is reliable and stands up to scrutiny. So this is a really difficult challenge, obviously, right? Balancing all these things. In my project, some of the steps that we're taking are, first of all, we're using a new testing method. So we're doing a lot of work to validate this DIY or field test with comparing it against laboratory analysis. And we plan to publish the results of those comparisons. At the same time, we're also working on making action plans that will anticipate credibility attacks. And think carefully about what we want to publicize, given that we understand that this is what happens in these kinds of projects. So again, not perfect solutions, but some ways to think about navigating the dilemmas. So I'm going to turn now to a third dilemma. And this is another one we expect to face, and it centers on questions of scale. So for this question, I want to talk about another example from our book, the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So on March 11th, 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami hit the northeastern part of Japan. Several nuclear reactors lost electricity and 3 reactors partially collapsed. So we've just had the 10-year anniversary of this disaster. The government declared an evacuation zone near the reactors and tested food for radioactive contamination. But many people felt that it wasn't enough. They wanted more information and better protections. So in many communities, volunteers built laboratory testing capabilities. And the goal was to help consumers, particularly mothers who were responsible for most of the food preparation, to check food radiation levels. And so this didn't just help them to avoid contaminated food. As my collaborator, Aya Kimura, has argued in her work, it also allowed them to resist accusations that they were being irrational and too fearful. So these kinds of accusations were widespread in Japan after the disaster, really playing on cultural stereotypes of overly protective moms. So again, there's another example of how perceptions of credibility come into play in these kinds of cases. In another case, another project, an organization called SafeCast developed a mobile radiation sensor so that people could monitor the environment and share their data. This work was really important for demonstrating that radioactivity was not limited to the officially designated no-go zone. But I think it's also really interesting and important to point out that the Japanese government has also promoted some kinds of radiation sensing, in particular, individual monitoring, personal monitoring. Authorities have argued that these personal radiation devices allow individuals to reduce their exposure levels, even if they're living in contaminated environments. There are still parts of Japan that have very high levels of radiation, but because the focus of measurement is on the individual body, the government has maintained that it's possible for people to avoid radiation and stay safe. And so this has allowed people to stay in their communities, which I think is a very good thing. But it also allows the government and the nuclear industry to pass safety responsibilities onto the public. That is, it's your job to monitor your exposures and to reduce your exposures, that you're now responsible for managing that. So I want to unpack the relevance of this particular case to our soil study. We need to scrutinize how scale is working here as well. We know on one hand that scaling up local observations by aggregating them in databases can sometimes have the problem of obscuring local context. I think, for example, the map I showed earlier of high blood lead levels in my region, my city. Right, it's one giant red blob, but it doesn't tell us which particular playgrounds are contaminated. It doesn't tell us why kids are getting exposed in one place or another, right? So that local context really matters and can get obscured. But at the same time, if we look at what happened with individual monitoring in Japan, scaling observations locally can have the unwanted effect of naturalizing problems that have non-local or systemic origins. So let me put it this way. In Japan, hyper-local organizing or monitoring at the body level, it made it simply a personal risk to be avoided. And so in our project, we worry that individualized soil testing, right? Just testing somebody's yard, somebody's garden, thinking about that at an individual scale might produce the same kind of thinking. Lead is in our neighborhoods because of a lead industry that operated on a national scale and because of the combustion of leaded gasoline everywhere in our country. So we have to think about the right scale for addressing this massive challenge. We don't have an easy solution to this one. We don't have a fix for this in this project. Some of the things that we're doing is we're planning to make collaborative maps that try to keep these scalar tensions in focus, right? So we can put measurements in context, but connect them to people's local knowledge of a place. And we want to think about how to avoid naturalizing the choice to address lead at the household scale, right? Always connecting what's happening locally to the historic causes of pollution that go and historic causes of environmental injustice that go far beyond the choices of individuals. So I want to now just start sharing a couple of conclusions, or at least thoughts for moving forward in our discussion today. So I just want to reiterate the points I made at the beginning about centering justice in citizen science. A few questions we can all ask ourselves. Does your project help to expand participation in political decisions? Does it enable the production of knowledge from vantage points that are often left out of science? And does it name and challenge environmental injustice? As we think about these questions, I think we have the beginnings of an agenda for every citizen science or community science project. First of all, I want to maintain that ethical citizen science, doing citizen science ethically, demands attention to justice. We can't avoid these questions. When we start to think about justice seriously, though, we start to identify dilemmas. And identifying those dilemmas really needs to be part of planning and implementing citizen science projects. There are no easy solutions. I've told you about my own project, struggling to find solutions to some of these dilemmas, but they can't be ignored. We have to keep grappling with them. And a really important way to grapple with them is to find research partners, whether they're interdisciplinary researchers outside of your own discipline, or community partners, or ideally a combination of those, who have relevant knowledge of context, right? We all know something about a context, but you probably need to work with someone who understands the historical context of a place, the social context of a place, the cultural context. So thinking about forming those coalitions is important. And finally, I think we really need to call on research administrators and research funders to invite community members into research agenda setting processes much earlier in the process of forming these kinds of projects than is typically supported. It's asking a lot to bring community members into writing a grant proposal if they're not getting paid to do that kind of work. And it's difficult for researchers to form those kinds of partnerships without having the funding to do that as well. So we really need to start thinking about shifting the way we support these kinds of projects if we value them as an intervention into the environmental injustices in our society. So I'm going to leave it there, but I just want to give a couple of big thanks. Of course, all the thanks to my collaborators who are just a wonderful team to work with, and I'm learning so much from. I want to thank the comic book artists who made some of the illustrations that you saw here today, who are also just amazing. The Sanctuary for Independent Media, the National Science Foundation for being so generous in supporting my work over the years, my collaborator, Aya Kimura, and of course, all of you for taking the time on this Earth Day to listen to me speak. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was really, really wonderful. And I've got a million questions. And I'm going to start off with a question from myself, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and then I will go through the ones as they populate. So I really appreciated how this presentation sort of framed the questions that you ask yourself as you're putting together a research project, and how you're connecting kind of the research questions to these broader questions of justice. Now, I'm personally very interested in my own work in sort of how the research that comes out of these projects can inform projects or regulation or policy in and of themselves. So have you, in these multiple case studies, have you seen how regulations, policy, other projects are incorporating knowledge from these vantage points that are commonly left out? So thinking less, instead of epistemic justice, more about kind of epistemic equity and how that knowledge might level in some way to scientific or other perspectives?
Yeah, this is a very important question. So there are a few different sort of pathways through which participatory research projects can influence policy. So there are sort of the formal mechanisms that sometimes are arranged. So for example, in the case of volunteer water monitoring, depending on states vary. So some states have actually, formalized the participation of volunteers in the collection of water quality data that they then use for example, tracking their achievement of policy goals under the Clean Water Act. So there are examples of states formalizing that kind of role for volunteers. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum is when citizen science projects strengthen people's commitment to activism and doing the kind of policy advocacy that gets, say, the EPA to pay more attention to air emissions around a particular facility. And then that might lead to a bigger policy level change or regulatory action. In the case of water monitoring in Pennsylvania, there's been some other research about some of the outcomes of these projects. The Alarm group based at Dickinson has been tracking some of the outcomes of the work that they've been doing. And they noted that where there were pollution incidents found, they were often things that were people would report it to their local regulatory officials, and they were usually around things more like erosion or issues that could be sort of addressed locally without becoming a really big sort of litigation kind of issue. So we really see a variety of different things, right? So there's like informal, like, call and report something that you see, formal integration into regulatory processes, and then research that strengthens advocacy and in a more contentious way pushes for policy change. I'm sure there's other varieties within that spectrum, but those are the ones that I mainly see.
Great, thank you. So we have a question coming from Peter Groffman. So he says, wonderful talk. You raised very interesting questions about scale. How do you think we should address these for soil PB or soil lead for water quality impacts of fracking?
Yeah, so both of those issues you want to talk about was the question, how do we talk about it in terms of lead and how do we talk about it in terms of water quality?
Yes, those are two separate questions, but I read them together.
Okay, yeah, excellent. So I'll try to tackle the lead issue first, right? So one of the things that we've learned in doing this work about lead is that, at a large scale, we already understand all the issues, right? So people will often say, well, we already know that lead is poisonous. We know that it does all these different harms, right? Even to adults. We also know how lead got into the environment in all different places, right? So what are the questions? Well, the questions are actually really these locally scaled things, right? So on your block, where is the soil contaminated and a pathway for exposure, right? So it's very local scale. One of the problems is that we're tracking that through blood lead tests, rather than the slightly scaled up. So we're testing the individual body rather than the environment that they're in. We still need to really look at a very local scale when we think about lead exposures, but waiting until people are poisoned is a little too late. That's the wrong scale, I would argue. And many people working in this area have argued that as well. But we actually just need teams of people to be identifying exposed soil or garden soil, places where the soil is contaminated and is a pathway for exposure. And there's a lot of easy solutions to it, right? You can build raised bed gardens, you can cover things with mulch, you can build a deck, right? There's lots of stuff you can do to prevent exposure. This is not a hard problem, but the difficulty is actually putting the resources toward doing the work at the appropriate scale, the scale where people can actually use that knowledge to protect themselves. And we just haven't had the financial commitments to do that, or the scientific commitments to do it either. In terms of watershed monitoring, so this one, I think the scale questions are really fascinating because we have seen a lot of really interesting initiatives from the time that I was doing that research in 2012 to the present, of people trying to aggregate the work of many different volunteer water monitoring groups to do sort of higher level analysis, right? Can we find a connection between the pollution that's found, in seemingly isolated incidents across different watersheds to, say, the prevalence of different kinds of gas drilling activities? As far as I know, that kind of research hasn't borne much fruit, right? With this, but there have been some, there's lots of questions about what kind of information is getting aggregated, and if it contains the kind of information that matters to people locally. Like, often there's a disconnect between what people care to observe locally and what kind of information you might need to do an analysis, say at a state or a river basin scale. So a lot of really interesting challenges around that. Tons of people are trying to figure it out, but it's very, very difficult.
Great. We have a question from Shannon Ledoux, who asks, can you share more about the specific strategies you've used or seen that increase participation, particularly in underserved communities?
So I think that obviously this is a question that people are asking a lot, because I think this is a more systemic systemic problem in science, right? We still talk about underrepresentation of women and people of color in science is a very significant problem. And so extending that out into citizen science, I think, is in many ways no different. So these are pretty serious systemic barriers to inclusion. But in terms of outreach, right? So I think that the groups who have been really successful with that are spending a great deal of time building trusting relationships with organizations that already exist. I'm thinking, for example, Aya and I did a workshop a couple of years ago about citizen science relating to food and agriculture. We brought together a bunch of teams of scientists and their community partners to talk about the work that they had done together. And those really successful examples were ones where there was already an existing community organization that was interested in questions of justice or community health. And then the right kind of match was made with researchers. And I think that if we think about communities as already organized, as already having resources and knowledge and leaders, then I think there's a better chance of actually forming successful partnerships rather than sort of just abstractly trying to reach out to people, in your city. So those are, from the examples that I've seen, that's a really important strategy. But also everyone at that workshop emphasized the importance of time and listening, and actually organizationally and culturally structuring spaces for meetings where everybody has equal amount of time to speak, where you really explicitly try to level the status markers within the group, right? There's a lot of things that have to happen at the interpersonal level to make those partnerships last and be meaningful for everyone involved.
Thank you. I have so many of my own questions, but we're going to keep going with the Q&A. So Farah asks, are there resources that you recommend that can sort of give further reading or background in this topic? Are there kind of key texts for you that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Well, so of course I'm going to just suggest reading the book that I wrote with Aya Kimura. But in that book, we actually have, we created an appendix of resources. So there's a lot of different materials that we list at the end for if you're at whatever stage you're in and deciding to get involved in these kinds of projects. So I would suggest that as a guide. It might be useful. And it involves, it includes information about citizen science groups in lots of different countries as well. There is so much written about citizen science now. So, there's a professional organization, very new, the Citizen Science Association. It's very wide ranging, and there's a journal that goes with it as well. I think there is there's growing pressure on the CSA and on the journal to do more work about inclusion and justice and equity. And so I think you can find some really good publications there, as well as I think the CSA meetings are going on right now, actually, and there are lots of great panels and talks that are going on these topics.
All right, and we've got about 4 minutes left, so I think this might be our last question, but we will see. This one's coming in from Z Grabowski, who says, I'm curious about your thoughts on the intersection of scales of data with levels of governance. Can and should we fit governance within existing frameworks of scientific research on contaminant sources, exposure, and mitigation elimination? Is this a promising avenue for scientists seeking to understand more equitable and effective governance systems, given that this type of work is often framed as being inherently unscientific?
Gosh, I love this question. This is something I think about a lot, right? Because obviously we need to think about scales of governance as well as scales of knowledge. And I have sometimes thought, we should align the scale of decision making with the scale of meaningful knowledge for people. An interesting example of that is the river basin commissions. In Pennsylvania, there's a Susquehanna River Basin Commission, there's a Delaware River Basin Commission, Ohio River has a slightly different arrangement. And so this is one of these things where it actually crosses multiple state boundaries, and the decision making is just focused on the contours of the river basin. I think that's a really, really interesting way to think about how we could organize governance around a lot of other issues. That said, I think it's not possible to make sort of easy equations between, well, local knowledge is important in certain places, and so we need to make decisions locally too. So I'm thinking in particular of the research by Jill Harrison, who has done really important research about pesticide exposure in California. And one of the things that she's argued in her work is that, in the sort of alternative food movement, there's been a lot of advocacy for we need to make more decisions locally. The food system is out of control, like localism is important. And what she has found is that when it comes to issues like farm workers being exposed to pesticides, local governance is not they're always making decisions in favor of the big growers that are using all the pesticides. And so actually bringing in state and even, federal level decision makers has been more impactful and more beneficial to the local people who are being exposed to pesticides. We've seen similar cases like this in the case of fracking as well, right? Where the EPA is more willing to act than state decision makers. So, I guess in the end, the answer is kind of well, it's complicated, kind of matters case to case. But one thing I think is that geographers have made a really important observation is that actually scales are always frames, right? In the way that we think about framing issues to get traction in the media, to get people to listen to you. We also are framing things as scaled in particular ways to draw in the interest of different scales of governance, right? Do we want the EPA to pay attention, or do we want the local county conservation district to pay attention? So thinking about your own work as doing that framing as you're doing scientific research is actually really important, right? Because depending on how you frame, how you collect data for your study, you are implicitly framing that as aiming toward a particular level of governance. So I'm sorry, that's a really complicated answer, but I think it's a really complicated situation.
I think that was a great answer, and that question of framing is so important, and specifically when we're thinking about the outcomes of our research, is particularly in environmental management and whatnot. So we are at noon. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I really want to thank Dr. Kinchy for this fabulous talk. For those who are signed up for discussions later, we look forward to chatting with you, and everyone else have a great rest of your week. So thank you.
Thanks. This has been so great. I really appreciate all your questions and comments, and it's great to be connected with all of you.